So first of all, I want to thank everyone. I know it took a little while to get in tonight. Just we got overloaded with so many of Peter's fans, which is really great. So thank you very much for that. Uh, Couple of things. Please, nobody record tonight's talk. It may be available, and we'll let you know at a later date on our YouTube channel. And if you could, when you go to our YouTube channel, which we'll put into the chat room, please subscribe. We'd appreciate that. Um, I want to thank our sponsors who help us out over the course of many years and months. Epson, Photo Shelter, Pro Photo Daily, American Photography, and Archive Magazine. Tonight we have Peter Turnley, and I am absolutely thrilled. He's going to be talking about his new book, The Other California, 1975. We're thrilled that he's with us. You'll be able to purchase his book on his website, and that's the only place you'll be able to purchase it. And without any further ado, I give you Peter Turnley. Thank you again.
Well, thank you everyone for joining this evening. I'm actually going to be giving you a tour through my life in photography over the last 50 years. I'll also be talking about my new book, The Other California, 1975. I entitled this presentation, Moments of the Human Condition. I always say that for me, my premise about photography is that it's not really a lot about cameras. It's essentially about framing a moment that we want to hold on to for now and for all time, that we want to share with ourselves and we want to share with others. And if you accept that premise, and I think it's difficult not to, I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, classic industrial American city. I came of age in the early 1970s. This was the time of the Vietnam War. As we all know, the time of a lot of social tumult, the beginning of feminism, the height of the civil rights movement. It turned out that even though I grew up in one of the most conservative states in the country, I also came from a very progressive family politically. My father was very involved in civil rights. I was an obsessive athlete. I also grew up an identical twin. And when I was 16 years old, I had a serious ligament injury playing high school football. And when I was in the hospital, my parents brought me a book of photographs by the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. And as I laid in bed, I remember being blown away by how his vision informed me that there were all these moments of life that I was walking by without noticing. And I had all this time after school that I'd never had before because of this knee injury. So I bought a camera, and every night I started to drive down to the inner city of my hometown. I found a voice overnight with a camera. I found a way to speak. Every night I would come home after these forays into the inner city of my hometown. I would develop the latest roll of film that I'd made. And I would come upstairs and I would show my family the photographs sitting at the dinner table. And I'll never forget the gleam in their eye as they looked at my work. And in some ways, even though I went on to have 43 covers of Newsweek and my work has been published worldwide, maybe I have never had more pleasure than those early days when I simply was sharing something that I saw with members of my family. I went to the University of Michigan, and I was really miserable my freshman year of college. At the winter break, I came back to my hometown and I spoke to the mayor of the town, who was a very progressive mayor. And I told him that the city of Fort Wayne should hire me as a photographer to do photo essays around subjects that they were creating policy around. He liked the idea. And so for the second semester of my freshman year of college, I commuted between Ann Arbor and Fort Wayne. And I did about 8 different photo essays on different themes of city life. This was a photo essay I did on an emergency ambulance service. In some ways, this might have been the first news photograph I ever made. At the end of my sophomore year of college, I got a letter from a woman that I had worked with in Fort Wayne, and she had, unbeknownst to me, moved out to California and had taken a job with a office of the government called the Office of Economic Opportunity. She wrote me a letter asking if I'd be willing to come out to California and explaining to me that the Office of Economic Opportunity needed to do a report, a compliance report indicating why this department of the government had created social assistance programs for the poor and working class. And she wanted to know if I would come out to California and spend 4 months driving the roads in the city and the regions of California to do a photo essay on essentially poverty and the working class of that state. This was kind of a dream come true for me. So I went out to California in May of 1975. I was with my college sweetheart named Karen, who wanted to be a writer. And for 4 months, we were in every city, major city, and every corner of the state. We spent a lot of time in the San Joaquin Valley, a lot of time in cities, places like Fresno, Bakersfield, Modesto, also the major cities of California, the Tenderloin, Hunters Point, Bayview of San Francisco, Watson in Los Angeles, Oakland, California. Spent a lot of time in farm fields with migrant workers. And this experience when I was 20 years old of driving throughout the state of California at a time when so many people opened up their hearts and their lives to a 20-year-old was a really transformative moment in my life. I just want to stop for a second and make sure you're hearing me. Is everything all right?
Yes.
Okay. I rode trains with hobos. We stayed every night in flea bag hotels, or about $13 a night. I was paid essentially enough money to cover gasoline and diner food. This project had been very much inspired by the photographs of the Farm Security Administration. And I had always been very inspired since I was a young man beginning photography, by the idea that photography could impact social awareness and potentially impact social change. I'd been very, very inspired by photographers like Dorothea Lange, Jacob Riis, Louis Hine. Spent a lot of time with migrant workers. This was a Cesar Chavez United Farm Workers protest. This was a man that walked 30 miles every Friday night to pick up his Social Security check. There was a very interesting city in the San Joaquin Valley called South Dos Palos. It was essentially an all-black rural town. It was a place where Lyndon Johnson had gone to launch the war on poverty in 1960. At that time, it was considered the most poor per capita person in the United States. These photographs were essentially published in this report for the Office of Economic Opportunity, and they were also exhibited in the state capitol. But for 50 years, I've lived with a sort of sense of guilt that so many people that did open up their lives and hearts to me, that in many ways that their lives had not yet been significantly considered. And so after 50 years of these photographs laying dormant, I've recently published a book, The Other California in 1975. The response so far has been tremendous. It's a book that I self-published. It can only be purchased on my website. This was me when I was 20 years old with Karen. All copies are signed. I've self-published my last 4 books. I had published 5 books with major publishers before, but I'd always been somewhat frustrated that not only do you not make any money, but secondly, I couldn't find the books in bookstores. So I said to myself at one point, if it was going to be like that, if I wasn't going to lose money, I would be delighted in this day and age of the internet to at least know the name and email of every person that purchased my book. So 4 books ago, I began to self-publish my books. I don't cut any corners. I use a wonderful printer in China, a great designer in New York. I usually print somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 copies. My first book, French Kiss, I actually printed 10,000 copies, and that book has sold out. But overall, this process of self-publishing a book has been extremely gratifying. And as I said, I sign all copies, and I'm grateful to always know who is purchasing my books. My books can be ordered on peterturnley.com. I'd like to now start to go through my life in photography since essentially 1984. I'm going to stop for just 1 second. After this project in California in 1975, I went to New York with these photographs. I was supposed to start my junior year of college at the University of Michigan, but I I was invited to dinner by John Morris, the photo editor of the New York Times, and he invited W. Eugene Smith to come to dinner. He wanted me to show the photographs from California. And that night over dinner, W. Eugene Smith took me aside and he leaned over and he whispered in my ear and he said, Peter, you've got a great heart and a great eye. You can do this, but no one's ever going to hold your hand. But I encourage you to follow your heart and get out there and be the photographer that you can be. So on the heels of that, I actually dropped out of college my junior year of college, and I moved to Paris in 1978. I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to come back to that time in a minute. But after working as a printer in the great photo lab, Pictot, where Cartier-Bresson's prints were made, going to graduate school at an elite school of political science called Sciences Po, I eventually, in 1981, began a freelance career working in photography in Paris. And for a period of 3 years, I became essentially the photographer for the New York Times in Paris, photographing all over France. I started to do a lot of assignments for Time and Newsweek. 1984, I had a very lucky break, and Newsweek sent me out to Normandy to do a 1-month project on all the living veterans of D-Day, June 6, 1944. I came back to Paris after that assignment, and I had a stack of slides, and Catherine Graham happened to be in the office of Newsweek that day, and the bureau chief showed a photograph of an American veteran that was kneeling in front of a grave of his best friend that had been killed. They had both come in on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. This is the first time he'd been back in 40 years. And the bureau chief showed this photograph to Mrs. Graham, and she looked at it and she said, "This will be our cover of our magazine in the United States and all over the world next week." And I excused myself and I went and sat down in an office, and I had a little cry thinking that with the end of my finger, I had done something that was going to be seen by 30 million people around the world. This was a big break for me. Newsweek offered me a contract to be their photographer based in Paris in 1986. And for the next 20 years, I never really knew where I would be when I woke up in the morning. Unlike what most people think, I was never dispatched. It was expected that I would follow the news and I would make my own analysis of what was the big news story of the world every week. And this corresponded well to my interest because I had just finished a degree in international relations and modern world history. And I found that I had a really good very good nose for news. This first photograph, this was the first foreign trip I ever made, photographing the assassination, the aftermath of the assassination of Indira Gandhi in New Delhi, India, and the sectarian violence between Hindus and Sikhs. This was the moment that Rajiv Gandhi literally lit his mother on fire for her cremation. I began in 1988. I did a large series of photographs on the plight of refugees worldwide. This was a refugee in Mozambique, from a Mozambican refugee from Malawi, Eritrean refugees in Eastern Sudan, a Somali refugee, again in the Sudan. Throughout my career, I've had a real passion for photographing the plight of refugees, and I've photographed most of the refugee populations of the world. During this trip in 1988, I actually photographed 11 different refugee populations on all 4 continents. This was a photograph of an Afghan refugee in Peshawar, Pakistan. Young Cambodian refugees on the border with Thailand. As we all know, in 1986, when Gorbachev came to power, there were suddenly very big winds of change with his policies of perestroika. I worked throughout Russia and the Soviet Union for essentially from 1986 to 2000. I covered the whole Gorbachev era. I was in all of the republics of the former Soviet Union.
Wow.
I traveled wherever Gorbachev went overseas during his time in power. And during these times, as we all know, one could feel a sort of opening up and change all over Eastern Europe. And this led to the eventual breakup of the former Soviet Union. This was a photograph made in one of the Baltic states in Lithuania. 1988, I covered a major earthquake in Armenia where 35,000 people were killed. And this led us to all of the change that began of the revolutions in 1989 in Eastern Europe. This was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, I had actually been going to East Germany very often, and I was aware of change. I remember I was in New York on a quick visit, and I was at a exhibition at a museum, and someone came up and said, "Peter, the wall's coming down." And I thought this was a metaphor for change. And then three more people came up to me, and I flew that night and arrived in Berlin the day after the people began to come over the wall. It was a moment of incredible exuberance. And suddenly we began to have access to countries like Eastern Europe that we had never had great access to before. And we began to see the realities of these societies. There were protests every Monday night in Leipzig. And that fall and winter of 1989 was a roller coaster. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution in Prague happened. Thousands of people in Venice Square in Prague. And the next trip on the roller coaster was to Romania. One of the most surreal experiences in my life was that I photographed Nicolae Ceausescu, one of the most treacherous tyrants of Eastern Europe in the 20th century. I photographed him at I did a portrait for Newsweek at his summer house in Snagov in Romania in the early fall of 1989. And then in December of 1989, the Romanian Revolution happened. And one of the most surreal moments of my existence was actually being inside. This was a Romanian secret police that had been killed during the violence of the Romanian Revolution. The Romanian Revolution was far and away the most violent of all of the overthrows of 1989. And I found myself 4 months after I photographed Ceausescu alive, this is in his personal office in the presidential palace. The rebels had taken over his office. And I literally saw his face dead on his own television screen in his office the moment that he was executed. This was also a time of major arms talks between the United States and the Soviet Union, many summits between Reagan and Gorbachev. And then in 1989, the Tiananmen Square uprising began. I happened to be one of the first Western photographers to arrive in Beijing the night that Hu Yaobang died, which was the catalyst for the beginning of the student uprising. And I stayed for 2 months until 2 weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre. This was a student pleading Chinese troops not to enter Tiananmen Square. This was a real setback in some ways for me, witnessing literally 4 million students rise up and simply ask for more liberty, more freedom, and more liberty in their life. And to see that passion literally crushed by military hardware really was a dent to my sense of optimism at that time. And it took me a while to after those 2 months in China to actually move forward in a positive way. This was a mother that had just the morning after the Tiananmen Square uprising in June of 1989, they had just discovered her dead son in a morgue next to Tiananmen Square. In the early 90s, my life began to change. It began to be exposed to an incredible amount of human suffering and hardship and conflict. I began to cover man-made and natural disasters, civil war and war all over the world in the 90s. This was a major famine crisis in Somalia in 1992. People might ask how it's possible to stand and photograph someone dying of starvation. And I think that's a very valid question. The only way that I could do that was actually with the idea that possibly if one of my photographs was seen on the cover of Newsweek by 30 million people around the world, that it could in an indirect way impact change and aid coming to Somalia. And I will say, after the imagery of Ethiopia in 86 and Somalia in 1992, there was a lot of food aid that was brought both of those countries. The American military operation in 92 in Somalia ultimately was a failure, but imagery did actually provoke at least a desire for positive action. The crisis in Somalia was actually a man-made crisis. It was the result of a civil war between different warring factions in Somalia. This was a young boy named Mohammed. And when I made this picture, I said, this is enough. And I gathered him up and I took he and his mother to a feeding center, and we were told that he was too old to enter this feeding center. And I said I would come back and bring him to another place in the morning. There was too much warfare in that area that night, so I couldn't take him that night. I come back the next day and I rustled the small straw hut where Mohammed and his mother had been living. And his mother came out and I said, "Where's Mohammed?" And she told me Mohammed died last night. And I have never gotten over that moment. I'm still haunted to this day by the moments and the humanity that I saw suffering in Somalia in 1992. I think of all that I've seen, it was one of the things that has haunted me the worst. The Gulf War began in 1991 after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I happened to fly to Saudi Arabia immediately after the ground war began in 1991. And I was one of the first journalists to arrive in Kuwait as the Iraqi troops left. And the day after, we discovered a place called the Mile of Death that was outside of Kuwait City that was just this incredible scene of carnage, with thousands of Iraqis that had been killed by US and British planes that had strafed the highway of Iraqi soldiers trying to get back to Baghdad. At the end of the Gulf War, the Kurds rose up and tried to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but they were repelled by the Iraqi military, and eventually they fled in mass to the mountains of southern Turkey. And there was a huge scene of human suffering of at least 100,000 people in the winter in the cold mountains of southern Turkey at that time, with almost no food, no warmth, no comfort. One of the most exhilarating moments of my life was witnessing Nelson Mandela come out of prison in 1990. This photograph was made in his backyard in Soweto, literally the morning after he came out of 27 years of prison. The exhilaration of the anti-apartheid struggle and a new free South Africa was amazing. This was the first time that Nelson Mandela addressed a major crowd in Soweto. I witnessed the first free voting in the first free elections in 1994 in South Africa, another wonderful moment of hope and exhilaration. This was a photograph made in the village where Nelson Mandela was born in the Transkei, where there was literally on election day 100% pro-Mandela vote. I was very passionate about the anti-apartheid struggle. I grew up in a family, my father was very involved in the civil rights struggle and in civil rights in Indiana. His feelings were very badly hurt if he thought anybody was ever judged by anything other than the content of their character. And my whole life, I would say, in some ways, fighting for the civil rights of human beings has been one of my ultimate passions. At that time, in the early 90s, this world in Eastern Europe that had been closed began to open up, and we began to see these scenes that were like of these medieval horrors. This was a hospital in in Tirana, Albania. Albania was one of the most closed off countries during the Cold War period. This was an orphanage in Albania at that time. A factory. They're literally scenes out of, as I say, the Middle Ages. This was a photograph of a Romanian gypsy in the countryside in 1990. As I mentioned, I followed Gorbachev wherever he went for 6 years while he was in power on all of his foreign trips. At that time, one of the biggest news stories in the world was the Gorbachev story, and there was a lot of competition among the news magazines for access to Gorbachev. And this is a photograph that I'm relatively proud of. I managed to get into the Kremlin on Gorbachev's last day in power, and this is a photograph of him in his own personal office, just at the moment that he has decided to leave power. This was a very violent coup d'etat in Moscow in 1993. Gorbachev, after he left power. I covered the war in Chechnya in 1995. This was a turning point in my life. When I was with rebels in Chechnya, and at that time the Russians were shelling Grozny at the order of 3 mortar shells, a mortar shell every 3 seconds. And when you would hear a MiG fly overseas, it was too late because the plane had already launched a bomb and bombs were dropping right and left. I saw so much violence in Chechnya, and it was so terrifying that at one point I remember thinking to myself that the only way that I could really survive the fear that I was feeling was to not care whether I lived or died. And I remember that when I went back to Paris after that trip, I really thought about that a lot. I felt like I had crossed a line and I needed to pull back. I continued to cover conflict until, in fact, today. But I really became conscious of how far out in terms of the risk I was taking with my own life. And then the genocide in Rwanda happened in 1994. And there was a massive outflux of refugees from Rwanda, mostly Hutus, to the border with Zaire. And there was a massive cholera crisis of over 100,000 people that died of cholera in a period of just a couple weeks. It was as if you were walking down the sidewalk in Manhattan, and everywhere you looked, there was a dead body on the sidewalk. It was just more than the mind could comprehend. But throughout my life in photography, in spite of the fact that I've seen many very difficult moments, I also have witnessed incredible moments and gestures of kindness and generosity and courage and decency and goodness. The Rodney King riots in 1992 in Los Angeles. A Pope's trip to Cuba. I covered several Pope's trips. This was a Pope's trip to Poland. And I covered his funeral in the Vatican. I did a photo story on victims of landmines in Afghanistan in 1996. The war in Kosovo began in 1999. This was a Kosovar Albanian refugee that had been forced into exile by Serbs at gunpoint and forced to cross into Albania. He was told that his wife and children had been killed. And he was beside himself when I made this photograph, and he showed me these two pictures of his two little kids. This picture was the cover of Newsweek, but I was haunted to know what happened to him. I went back to Kosovo 6 months later, and I discovered the man, found him, and discovered that at the end it was a happy story, that he'd come home and had found his wife and children alive. I did a whole piece for Nightline interviewing him. Kosovar Albanian refugees during the war in Kosovo. The war in Bosnia. In 1988, I covered the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising on the West Bank. And in the 90s, I made many trips to Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. As we all know, this is a settler demonstration in the West Bank. We all know how painful this theme of conflict is for the region and the world. And what I can say is that throughout my time covering the conflict in the Middle East, I've always tried to cover this conflict with as much compassion and humanity for all involved as possible. This was Yitzhak Rabin's funeral. I did a photo essay, an exclusive photo essay on Putin when he first came to power. You've probably heard many leaders ask the question of, when they look into Putin's eyes, what do they see? I look directly into his eyes, and I can't answer that question. I was one of the only photographers that spent the whole night of 9/11 in the rubble of Ground Zero. I was in Boston that morning, and I drove all afternoon to get to New York. Most people don't realize that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the New York City police had declared a 4-mile perimeter around Ground Zero the biggest crime scene in the history of the United States. And I thought that and all journalists were evacuated. And I thought it was very important that this moment be documented for history. And I managed to get myself inside the perimeter and spent the whole night photographing at Ground Zero. This picture was made at 6 o'clock in the morning on 9/12. This was a fireman that I photographed at 6 o'clock in the morning on 9/12. This picture went on to be published very widely. And about a year after I made this picture, I got an email from a woman saying that her name was Linda and that she was so grateful that my picture of her boyfriend, Sal, was the only proof that they had of where he was the night of 9/11, because he simply couldn't talk about it. And she wanted to know if I would send a photograph. I said I would. I went away on a foreign trip overseas, forgot to send the print. A year went by. I get a second email. Dear Peter, sad news. Sal and I have broken up, but could you please send me the print? Had every intention of doing so. Again, went away on a foreign trip. Forget to send the print. I get a third email 2 years after I made this photograph saying, Dear Peter, great news. Sal and I got married. Now, can you please send the print? So I sent Linda an email saying, Linda, could you please send me your cell number? I need to talk to you. The night that I'd spent by myself at Ground Zero had started to come out of my pores and had become very confusing in my own mind. And I thought talking to Sal could help me. I asked Linda if I could talk to Sal. She said, Peter, he can't talk about it, but he saw that you've covered a lot of Harley Davidson rallies and you might like to talk to him about his Harley. So she passes the phone and I said, Sal, could you tell me what you were thinking about when I made this photograph? he started to cry. And after a few minutes, he gathered himself and he said, Peter, my firehouse was the first firehouse to be called to 9/11, to Ground Zero on 9/11. And I was with my best friend, Nikki, from childhood. And Nikki went up into one of the towers and it came down. And he said, I spent the whole night looking for him. And I've always felt so bad that I should have been the one up into the tower. And I said to Sal on the phone that night, I said, Sal, you should be so proud of yourself. You're a good man. And we agreed that night that we would get together on the eve of the anniversary of 9/11, the first time we could. 10 years went by, and I was always in Paris doing a workshop. On every night after we first met, every eve for 10 years, we would talk on the phone and tell each other we loved each other. After 10 years, on the 10th anniversary, we finally met and we went and had a steak. And when Sal took me home that night, before I got out, he said, Peter, would you listen to my telephone? I said, sure. I clicked on the recording button and he had recorded every message I had left him for the last 10 years. And when I got out of the car, he said to me, good night, Nikki. And I never felt like I deserved that. But I will say, I want to share this story because one of the things that photography has brought my life was to bring me into touch with so many of the heroes of our world, like Sal. Sal and I have now talked on the phone on the eve now for the last 20 years. And on this last eve of 9/11, Sal told me that he had been diagnosed with a brain tumor and he thought he only had 6 months to live. I received a phone call from his son about a month ago telling me that he had just passed away. I'll never forget Sal, and I will always talk to his son for the remaining years of my life on the eve of 9/11 in his honor. Covered the war in Iraq in 2003. I worked independent of the US military. I thought it was very important that there be an independent voice. I saw conditions as the US and British troops blasted forward towards Baghdad, leaving this vacuum of lawlessness. And after battles, I witnessed Iraqis in hospitals with no anesthesia, laying in puddles of urine. And I think many people don't realize that there have been 800,000 Iraqis killed since the beginning of the war in 2003 for a war that most people feel at this point was totally unnecessary. A young Iraqi girl that died of pneumonia because she couldn't get to a hospital because of bombing on the roads. The funeral of an American soldier from the war in Iraq. I covered photographs. I've photographed daily life all over the world. This was during the Holy Week and the Semana Santa in Seville, Spain. Fishermen in Ireland. A young Palestinian schoolgirl in a school in Gaza. A clown with the Cirque du Soleil. A circus outside of Paris. Young girls in Bolivia. A woman, an Orthodox Christian woman in Eritrea. Southern France. I spent 7 years photographing the life of one barbershop in Harlem. I've lived in Paris now since 1978, but after doing a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard during the year 2000, 2001, instead of just racing back to Paris, I rented an apartment in New York and split time for a period of time between New York and Paris. And this barbershop, the TriStar Barbershop, became my home for 7 years and became my family. One of the themes that I have photographed most in my life is the life of Cuba. I went to Cuba at first in 1987 with Gorbachev on a state visit to Fidel. And after spending so much time in the cold of the Soviet Union, Cuba was like communism under the sun. And I discovered a people that was so vibrant and so resilient, so courageous, so elegant and dignified. And I fell in love with the people of Cuba. I've been returning to Cuba, and I will come back to that a little bit later now for the last 20 years. A woman breastfeeding her baby in a church in Havana 12 days after the birth of her child. The day of a wedding in Havana. Port-au-Prince, Haiti, at the time of the return of Aristide. I covered the earthquake in Haiti. A scene in New York City, Mumbai, India, riding the R train in Brooklyn, the US-Mexican border. So now I want to move on. I've always felt like my life in photography has bridged the world between photojournalism and fine art. And I really don't like those boxes. I think that great photography, and whatever the medium is, whether it's photojournalism, fine art, fashion, conceptual, etc., that when it's done well, it essentially all is the same thing. What matters to me is the life of the world and expressing it with heart, compassion, and with dignity and elegance and grace. I moved to Paris in 1975 for the first time. I told you, I was this guy that grew up in Indiana. When I arrived in Paris in 1975, this was me at 20 years in 1975. Everything about France and Paris and the French language was just music to my ears and music to my life. It was this kind of chance to reinvent myself. I'd always kind of thought of myself as this, I don't know, sort of flat guy from the Midwest. And the styles of 1975 France were wonderful. It was a time of great ideological debate. The France was divided straight down the middle between the left and the right politically. And I found this vibrant discussion of ideas very, very exciting. And I immediately felt at home in Paris. And I developed a passion for the life of Paris. I believe that at this point, and I don't say this with any pretension, that I think almost without doubt that I'm the person that has most photographed the daily life of Paris in the last 50 years, all French photographers included. I had a very lucky break in 1981. The great French photographer, Robert Doisneau, who was the classic quintessential great humoristic Paris photographer, asked me to be his assistant. And he also asked if I wanted to be introduced to the director of his photo agency, Raffo. And this is what launched my young freelance career when I began to get assignments from Time and Newsweek and the New York Times. This is an important body of work for me to communicate after the pictures that I've just shown you, because there was one constant in my life, and that was wherever I went around the world, and I saw a lot of difficulty, a lot of human suffering and inequality and hardship and conflict and danger and death. And when I would come back from those places, Paris has always been an important form of therapy for me, emotional therapy. Even though Paris is a large metropolitan city that has problems of many major cities, has some of its own problems, I believe that without a doubt, not only is it the most beautiful city in the world, but there's no place else on earth where one can see on a daily basis so much public affection and romance and tenderness, expression of love between not only lovers, but family and friends and parents and children. I wake up every day when I'm in Paris and go out with my camera. And I wake up excited every day to approach a new day. I've published several books about the life of Paris. I published a book called Parisians. I've also published a book called French Kiss, A Love Letter to Paris. Both books are now out of print. I will most certainly be publishing a new book, a new Paris book, in the next year. I would say my cathedral is the life of Paris cafes. I spend a lot of time in cafes in the morning every day. Not only do I like coffee, but I absolutely just love the social life of Paris cafes and the opportunity to to speak to people and to hear their stories and to learn about their lives. I think if there's anything that I've done in my whole life that I'm really proud of and know is worthwhile, that is that I never miss an opportunity to turn and speak to the person that's sitting next to me, wherever I am, whether it's a cafe or a restaurant, on a bus or a subway. And I learn something from every conversation that I have. I mentioned earlier that this talk was going to be called Moments of the Human Condition. I believe that I've looked at life in the last 50 years straight in the eye. I don't think I've pulled any punches, but I really do believe that life is this kind of timeline of everything. On one end is life at its very best, with love and affection and tenderness and grace, sensuality. On the other end of the line is life in its worst, which we've just seen a lot of in different places around the world, and then every place in between during daily life. I come back to this work that I've done in Cuba. Another thing that's very important to me is to have this sense that I'm learning about life, that I'm learning how to live life better. Of course, Cuba has many problems, but maybe nowhere in the world, in 90 countries that I've traveled to, do I find people that teach me so much about how to live life on a daily basis. Cubans are among the most joyful, vibrant, kind, compassionate, graceful, dignified, strong people that one could ever find. And they live with incredible humility and humbleness. And I will say that one can feel whatever one wants about the system of Cuba. I'm in love with the people of Cuba. And I also think that, like in so many different places, that there's a mixture of systemically also things that are good and bad. In the past, Cuba actually had a very great medical system, great public education, a higher literacy rate than the United States. I think it would be time that the United States dropped the embargo with Cuba. It has done nothing but punish the people of Cuba for the last 70 years and has not had any impact upon change, except for the worst. One of my credos that I carry with me everywhere is that people all over the world are my brothers and sisters. I really don't like very much the notion of nationality and national borders. I'm going to quickly go through a body of work from covering the crisis in COVID. All of us knew this moment in time. I happened to find myself in New York when Cuomo declared a lockdown. And for the next 3 months, I walked the streets of New York every single day. And I took notes and asked people their stories. And I would publish albums of photographs on Facebook every day. I kept a diary. After 3 months, I went to Paris and continued to do this work covering COVID in Paris for the next 3 months. I eventually did a book called The Human Face of COVID-19, a New York-Paris visual diary.
Mm.
You know, we learn a lot about ourselves if we're open to learning. One day I was in Harlem and I approached this woman. It was a rainy day. Her name was Mary. She was 80 years old. I asked her how she was doing. She said, by the grace of God. And I had just bought an umbrella in a bodega, and I was holding the umbrella above my head. And two young African-American men walked by and walked up to me and said, why don't you give her your umbrella? And I remember feeling so ashamed that I hadn't thought of that myself. And I handed the umbrella to Mary, and I looked up the street and I saw these two young men looking back, and they had broad smiles. And I remember thinking to myself after that one of the benefits of this time, if there was any, was that young men like these two guys helped me be a better person, gave me a lesson about how to be a better person. I was very much alone during those 3 months in New York City, and I was staying on the Upper West Side. And as we all know, the 7 o'clock time of night when people would come out and bang on pots and pans, I needed that. It was very cathartic for me. This was Elmhurst Hospital at the beginning of the crisis, probably the epicenter of COVID in the whole world with Northern Italy. The morning I went to Elmhurst Hospital in Queens that day, there were 50 ambulances with COVID patients that showed up in 30 minutes. And there were 3 morgue trucks. This hospital was receiving so many patients who were dying of COVID at that time. As many of you that live in New York know, when you went to bed at night in New York at that time, there wasn't a minute of the night you didn't hear a siren. And you knew if somebody was in an ambulance, things were not going well. I go back, I photographed this medic at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said, "I'm not doing well." He said, "They're not giving us enough protective equipment, and we're really angry." And I said, "Would you mind if I write that?" And he said, "Please do. We all feel the same way." His name is Mike. So I stayed in touch with Mike, and about a month after I made this photograph, I get a call one day, and Mike told me that a famous New York medic named Tony had just passed away from COVID. Tony had trained about 80% of all New York medics. And he said that they wanted to send Tony off the right way the next day at his funeral. And there was going to be a long line, a mile of New York ambulances. And they wanted to take Tony out with an honor guard. And they wanted to know if I would come and photograph this moment. I said, of course it would be an honor. So I went to this funeral home in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Tony didn't have a family, so he was buried in this incredible rudimentary casket that was made of tin. And I remember we went into the funeral home, and there were eventually about 30 medics that were gathered around. I had never met Tony, but listening to the medics talk about their love and affection for Tony, I had the impression that I knew him. And one more time, this was a moment when photography gave me this sense of being part of something that was beautiful and important. After they sent Tony off that night, I sent Mike a whole set of these photographs. And I got a phone call from Mike about 7 o'clock at night. And Mike said, "Pete, we can't thank you enough for your photographs." And I got real quiet. And I said, "Mike, I'm by myself, and I don't know what's going to happen if I get this thing. I don't even know what to do. I don't know where to go." And Mike said, "Pete, you have to know that from this moment forward, you're part of our family. We'll take care of you." And I can't tell you what that meant to me. Part of the reason I did this diary is because this is our story. Every one of us watching this presentation tonight lived this moment. This was our world, and this was our story. I'll never forget this man standing in front of Zabar's. Yes, he wasn't wearing a mask, but I remember looking at him and thinking, this guy was at the end of his life, and there was nothing that was going to get in the way of him exhibiting and demonstrating and living with his dignity and his honor. I met people on my own street. So real quickly, I'm so sorry for these interruptions, but so everyone was telling me that the war in Ukraine was not going to happen. And I have a good nose for news, and I would say to people, I'm not so sure about that. And then one morning I read that the Russians had transported blood to the border with Ukraine, and I knew the invasion was going to happen. I remember going to the cafe, and someone told me they wanted to bet me any amount of money that this wouldn't happen. I said, "Well, I'm not going to bet any money, but it is going to happen." And of course, we know it did. Initially, I didn't think I was going to get involved. I'm now 68 years old. I actually have 2 knee replacements, a hip replacement. I get around really well. I walk really fast. But I can't run like I used to. And I didn't think it was even prudent of me to cover combat in the Ukraine. But like so many things in my career in photography, I suddenly began to see the imageries of this mass exodus of refugees from Ukraine. And I just felt like I had to get involved. So initially, I didn't have any intention of going into the Ukraine. I flew to the border with Poland and the Ukraine, and on a border town where there were thousands of Ukrainian, mostly women and children, that were fleeing the war, that were crossing into Poland. But after being there for 3 days and again seeing these images of this mass exodus in this train station in Lviv in western Ukraine, um, I said to myself that I had to go and document this moment. So I took a train into Ukraine and to Lviv. I spent 3 days there. And then I did something and had an experience unlike anything that I'd ever had in my lifetime. I boarded a train leaving Ukraine with thousands of Ukrainian women and children and older men, a train trip that was 12 hours long, no toilet, no food, with thousands of people that were in one moment losing everything they had in their life, going to a destiny that they didn't know. And I want to show you a film that communicates that experience. Well, I'd like to end the evening with this photograph, which is of a symbol that is close to probably most of our hearts. As you've seen tonight, I believe I've witnessed a lot of human life over the world of the last 50 years, and I've witnessed a lot of people that have struggled with everything they have for a better life and for freedom, and they fought for it. They've torn walls down instead of built them. And I feel it's incumbent upon myself at every opportunity at this point, and I'll take the chance this evening with this forum that in terms of our lives and in terms of the life of my country of origin, the United States, and our world, I can't imagine a more important moment that is upon us than these next elections in November of 2024. And I really do believe that our biggest enemy in life is ignorance. I think it's when we don't know each other, when we don't feel each other, when we don't accept the fact that a lot of life is not black and white, that the truth often lies in the shadows, and that there's a lot of complexity involved in very difficult situations and issues where people have different interests. I just want to end by saying that I think the big question in front of us is the sun rising or setting? And I think it's going to require energy on the part of all of us to make sure that it rises. And with that, I want to thank you all. I can't say sorry enough for the technical glitches we've had tonight. This has never happened to me, but you're all champions for having stayed with me throughout all of this. If there would be anything that this evening could potentially have done, it would be, I'm hoping it would be maybe just reminding all of us that life is pretty wonderful on a day-by-day basis, and we've only got it one day at a time. And I make photographs every day, and in order to share what I can and what I see with love and with my heart. Thank you.
Peter, you can imagine you should take a little peek into the chat room. The reaction has just been phenomenal, and I think everyone has already forgotten about the tech problem. So just a couple of quick questions, just to, because I know it's in the middle of the night for you. Who is your printer in China?
The name of the printer is 1010 Printing, and they actually have an office in New York, and they're wonderful.
Come in.
I'm hoping
Peter,
this is the last time that's going to happen. Oh,
yes,
Jesus.
it is. But Peter, one more question about the book. What's the size of the book? What are the dimensions?
I think that it's a almost square book. I love that format because it enables the horizontals and verticals to be the same size. And I think it's approximately 11 or 12 by 12
Okay.
inches. It's a nice size book.
Yep. The subjects that you shoot in the cafes and all around Paris, is all of that just capturing the moment? Are you, because somebody asks, is any of that, do you have permission? Are you, getting releases? Any of that,
Well,
Peter?
what I do is, you know, my approach often, particularly these days, is two things. Either one, I see a moment that is a story that interests me and I photograph it, but then I almost always go up to people and I'll literally show them the back of my camera and ask them, and I have a business card with my name and my email, and I'll ask people if they'd like me to send the photograph. And they almost always say yes. So that's one situation. The other situation is where I may see a situation that I know is going to become an interesting moment, and I may go and introduce myself and explain that I'm a photographer and ask if I might make a photograph. And when people say yes, then I often just wait until a moment does happen and people have forgotten me. But the most important thing is that I do send people photographs all day long. And I get at least 10 to 15 emails back a day of people thanking me from their heart that I have memorialized a moment that's important to them. And I think it's really important for all of us. You're not going to ever hear me say I take a picture, I make a photograph. It's a creation. And part of reminding myself that what I'm doing is a creation and it's something that's good, is actually making other people feel good with it with this creation. I'm not stealing something. I'm not taking something. It's something that I'm creating and I love to give it to people. And it gives me a sense of well-being as well overall.
Yeah, and share with us as you send us off for the evening where Mike and Sal sit in your heart.
Um, you know, that's a really good question, but I think what the Mikes and Sals of this world have done for me, and God only knows that I hope that I can emulate this as I go forward, is living life with grace, living life with courage and determination and dignity, but with grace. And because I think many of you here I know have gone through hard moments in your life, many probably much harder than I have. But I think we all are going to go through hard moments. It's part of our existence. And I don't think there's anything really objective about any of this. I think a lot has to do with, how we approach it. I've been struck my whole life, we all grow old at some point, but I've noticed some elder people, and I don't want to blame them because maybe it's just become from such a hard life and hardship, but I'll see elder people maybe walking on the street with their shoulders slumped. And then sometimes I'll see elder people, no matter what their condition, standing up tall and with their head up. And so much of that, I think, is a question of choice, not always. But that part of it, which can be a choice, the Mikes and the Sals of this world encourage me to get through this trip as well as I can. I just want to relate one final anecdote related to that. When I was living in Harlem, I used to see a guy in my elevator every day that had a smile on his face every day. He was an elder guy. One morning, I get in the elevator about 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's just he and I, and he's got this big smile on his face. And I couldn't help myself. I said, I just have to ask you, you're always smiling. What is that all about? And he looked at me and he said, the way I look at it, we all got to get through this thing one way or the other. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a masterpiece out of it. And maybe people like that guy and the Sals and the Mikes encourage me to hope and think that maybe we could all make a masterpiece out of it.
There you go. Well, I mean, you took the words out of everyone's mouth there. What we saw tonight was a masterpiece. Was a masterpiece of a career, and the sentiment behind it is incredibly inspiring to everyone. One last question. Can people buy prints directly from you if they contact you, Peter?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So
I'm very proud. People collect my
there you go,
prints from all
Karen.
over the world. There's a page on my website, and just email my email on my website and I'll share prices with you, but I offer very discounted prices to people that buy them directly from me.
There you go. Peter, thank you. And this is your second or third time with us. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you always coming in. And the next book, entity in your career, of course, you have a standing invitation with us. We'd love to have you back. And I think we'll be able to edit this presentation into something beautifully cohesive that hopefully we'll be able to let people know about. So
Well, thank you very much, Frank. And one more time, my apologies to everybody for these technical glitches, and I thank you for bearing with me. And I wish you all my best. I'd love for you to go on my website and take a look at my book. It's a book I'm proud of, and I'd love for you also to spread the word to your friends and family. Thank you.
so everyone, good night. We'll see you in a couple of weeks, and everyone be safe. And again, Peter, thank you so